Hello and welcome to October with the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I know sometimes it's sort of a scary month, October, but for us, it is not. I am thrilled to say that I have two of my very favorite authors joining us. Helen Castor, who has written an amazing new book about the time of transition from Richard II to Henry IV and everything that means. Also, Ramie Targoff, who has a fascinating book, Shakespeare's Sisters, How Women Wrote the Renaissance. It's just amazing. So I can't wait for you to listen to these. I'm so glad you're here on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics in October. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am so excited to be here with Ramie Targoff. She is the author of a book, and I shared this with her, Shakespeare's Sisters. And this is something I was listening to while I was on a plane, and I was so into this wonderful book that when the pilot said, "We're getting ready for landing," I honestly thought, oh no, don't land yet. I am not ready to get off this plane and have to stop listening. That has never happened to me before. So thank you so much. I was so excited you were able to join us and talk to us about these amazing women. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm delighted to hear also that you enjoyed the audiobook, because that's something I've never fully experienced. I have heard a little snippet, but I've never actually sat down and listened, I confess, to the audiobook of my own book. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It's really easy to get lost in it. I also get lost in the reading, but somehow the audiobook was just in my head in a beautiful way. So I wanted to start with the title, because the phrase Shakespeare's sister, the idea of that was sort of made famous by Virginia Woolf, who imagined that had Shakespeare had a sister with literary talent and interests, she sort of would have been doomed not to be able to write in her day. And that's not true. So why do you think, Virginia Woolf was in the 20th century. Why were we still thinking, or was she still thinking that's possible? What changed to reveal this rich literary experience of these women at the time?
So it's a really interesting question. And I can tell you that when I graduated from college in 1989 with a degree in English literature, I had never read a word written by a woman during the Renaissance, period. So, Virginia Woolf was writing, at the beginning of the 20th century. I was at university at the end of the 20th century. It turns out that the women whom we now have identified as really extraordinary writers during Shakespeare's lifetime were all out of print. There's one exception, which we'll get into later, of Amelia Lanier was in print, but in a very compromised way that, for example, my professors at Yale University in the late 80s would not have known about Amelia Lanier's writing. So the simplest answer to your question, Carol, is that Virginia Woolf truly would have had no access to women's poetry, to women's drama, to women's translations of the Bible, all the things it turns out women were doing. They were all out of print when Virginia Woolf wrote her famous account of Shakespeare's imaginary sister in a room of one's own. It turns out, as you've already said, that she was wrong, that there were women writing. But I want to just emphasize that her main point, that it was hard to be a woman writer at the period, is absolutely true. So it's not that there were lots and lots of women. We're talking about maybe 6 or 8, not like 400 women. And that her primary conditions, as your listeners who will remember A Room of One's Own will remember, her primary conditions for being a woman writer, for being a writer, are having a decent income of your own and having a physical space where you can write, which means not surrounded by children and people milking the cows and so on. And so those conditions were much, much harder for women than for men. Women were at home without jobs, without offices, without places they went to work. They were uneducated for the most part during the Renaissance. They did not have independent income. All their money was connected either to their father or to their husbands in most cases. So that made things very, very hard. So when I called the book Shakespeare Sisters, I'm both responding to Virginia Woolf and saying, you're right that it was hard, but I'm also saying you're wrong in that you couldn't have known about, but there were, in fact, a strong group of women who not only were writing, but one of her points is if you could write, you would be treated terribly. She conjures up this very dark image of our imaginary sister Shakespeare, and she says she would be treated like a witch, like a crazed person. She would live in a horrible, miserable hovel of a cottage. And she finally says she would probably take her own life in despair. So it's as dark as you can be. And in my book, I tell the story of four women who lived reasonably happy lives, who had their ups and downs, but who thrived. Three out of the four of them were published during their lifetime. The other one was well known for the work she was doing. So these are not, socially ostracized, terribly treated, loners. They were integrated into the world they lived in, and they managed to write.
That's a really good point. So she was both right and wrong, but you can see
Yes.
how limited her perspective was. But these women did exist and did thrive, as you say. So tell us about, we're not going to go into detail about all four women, but tell us about the four women and how you chose these four,
Sure.
what they sort of represent.
Okay. So for the last decade or so, I've been teaching both a graduate seminar for PhD students and then an undergraduate class on women writers in the Renaissance. And I'm able to teach that class, Carol, because now in the last 20 to 30 years, all of these women writers have been rediscovered, edited, published, and put into circulation. So again, in 1989, when I graduated from college, none of the good editions of these women was available. And now they're all available. So that just tells you that there's been a really marked revolution in what we know about women's writing in the period. So when I started teaching in the late 90s, I just started to study these women and get access to them because, as I say, during my education, my entire PhD program, I didn't read any of them either. I graduated with a PhD in English in 1996, still nothing. If I'd had a professor who was very, very interested in this, they could have gotten their hands on a few of these women. But let's just say, to put it very simply, by the year 2000, number of women from the English Renaissance were back in print who hadn't been printed often for 400 years. So I started to study these women and get more and more interested in what they could contribute to my understanding of the period. And once I got a handle on the material, a little bit like what we were talking about before with my book process, first I like to do the research and then I like to do the writing. In this case, I like to be familiar with the material before I start teaching it. So it took a little while before I started to mount the courses. But when I started teaching, I had around 10 women, I would say, who I thought were, very accomplished writers from the period and was interested in sharing with my students. When I decided that I should write this book, first of all, I was motivated by the fact that outside of experts in the field, and when I say experts in the field, I mean actually very narrow experts in the field, because even people, for example, teaching courses on Shakespeare might not know about these women writers, because if they also, like me, got their PhD in the 80s or 90s or earlier, they wouldn't necessarily have been introduced to them. So I realized that very, very few people in our world knew about the existence of these women writers. And yet people are so interested in Shakespeare. They're so interested in Henry VIII. They're so interested in this period in history that it was a real disservice to our understanding of the past, to our cultural history, that these women weren't better known. So I both was interested in bringing these women to people's attention, but I was also interested in expanding our vision of what it was like to be in the Renaissance, because really we only had a male perspective. I then decided I could not write a book describing 8 or 10 writers. It would be too long, and I wouldn't be able to go into depth of the kind I like to do. So with the advice of my editor, I decided to focus on 4. we decided four was a good number. And then I had to make the hard choice of which four. In a few cases, it was obvious. In a few cases, it was more of a hard decision. But in the end, what I decided to do was to apply two really basic criteria. One, the woman had to be living within Shakespeare's lifetime and sort of roughly his contemporary. A few of them are very close contemporaries, a few of them are younger. But I couldn't have someone who was born in the 1620s. So Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616. And so they had to share most of that lifetime. And actually, this is a sort of subset of that. And they had to live under Queen Elizabeth. They had to have been born into Queen Elizabeth, because Queen Elizabeth is, in a way, as you know from reading the book, a fifth character, a fifth heroine in the book. The book starts with Queen Elizabeth because I think it's so important for these women to have had, as a role model, the most powerful figure in their kingdom. So they had a woman monarch who was a writer, who was a scholar, who was a thinker, in addition to other talents. So they had to be roughly Shakespeare's contemporary and be born into Elizabethan England. That's the time criteria. And then the other criterion I applied was that they had to be writing in different genres. So I didn't want three people writing plays, because I really wanted to convey to my readers the breadth, the diversity of work that they're writing. So I chose one woman who's primarily a translator, one woman who's a poet, one woman who's a playwright, and one woman who's a historian memoir writer. So I had four very different kinds of writing so that I could really show the just the range of things that women were doing during the period as writers.
That's great. And I loved that in reading it, that you got such a wide scope of what they were doing, which again gives you a sense of the period through these four different sets of eyes and what they're doing with their time. So we are going to just take a look at a couple of these, and I'd like to start with Mary Sidney. Now, she had some connection to the Queen, a pretty close connection in some sense. So
yes,
tell us about Mary and her court life, her connections there, and how maybe it influenced her writing. She also had a brother that played a pretty big part, and that's an interesting part of that story as well.
absolutely. So Mary Sidney was born into a quite distinguished but not wealthy aristocratic family. So they had lots of good connections, but they didn't have a lot of cash. And that ended up mattering because when she was a very young girl, just a young teenager, she went to serve at the court of Queen Elizabeth as a maid of honor. That was a very honorary position that was unpaid, but was a great opportunity for young girls or young teenagers to meet lots of people, to experience court life. So when she was, I think, 13, it might have been 14, but very, very young, she went to live with the Queen. And within a year or so, she had managed to snag one of the wealthiest, most significant aristocrats in the country for her husband. And that was, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, who had lots and lots of money, who had magnificent properties, who was much older than she and, had been married twice before, but was desperately in need of a male heir, which he had not managed to have in his earlier two marriages. So she was married off when she was 15, to this older man, and that could have been the end of it. But luckily for Mary, she had grown up in a family that valued the girls as well as the boys' education. And her brother, whom you mentioned, Sir Philip Sidney, was one of the truly great poets of the entire period. Like if you said to someone who studies English Renaissance literature, name the three top poets of the Elizabethan era, they would say Shakespeare, Sidney, and Spenser. There's no question about it. I mean, he was really an extraordinary figure. So Mary had grown up with an older brother who was not just well educated, but had this incredible gift. He very sadly died due to battle wounds when he was still young, and she was only 20, I think she was 23 when he died, so he was in his early 30s. When he died, he had been working on several literary projects that she then took up and either completed or made sure they were published in the right form. She became, in effect, his literary heir and executor. And so it's really interesting, and this happens a lot, to think, what would have happened if he hadn't died, if he'd lived to 70? Would she have started writing? What would have happened, if she hadn't had a brother? Would she have had the inspiration to write, and so on? So there's so many contingencies, so many things that, just happened because of this. But what her primary contribution to English literary history has been, and this is directly connected to her brother, is that he had begun a beautiful poetic translation of the Book of Psalms from the Bible. And basically, the Psalms hadn't been translated into a sort of elevated poetic form at this point. So until the Reformation, which had just happened, 40 years earlier in England, people would not have been translating the Psalms in this way to be, literary works, to be. English wasn't counted as a sacred language. English was not the language of prayer. It was either Latin or Hebrew, depending on where you were, or Greek. But the point is, to make the Psalms into beautiful English poetry had not really happened before. So he started this project, and he had translated 43 of the 150 Psalms when he died. Mary got her hands on this manuscript, polished off the 43 Psalms that he had started, because he'd only drafted them. They weren't necessarily his finished version. And then she decided, why not translate the remaining 107? So this is a massive project. And the result of it is really, to this day, perhaps the most beautiful translation of the Psalms in English in terms of poetic translations. So there are very complex poetic forms. There are sonnets, there's Dante's Terza Rima. There are all different kinds of poetry. And John Donne, one of the greatest poets of the 17th century, wrote a whole poem praising this translation and saying it elevated the English language to a new level. So that is her sort of greatest accomplishment. But she also wrote original poetry. She wrote a magnificent poem to Queen Elizabeth. She wrote a beautiful elegy to her brother. She wrote a small, short pastoral dialogue. So she did write original things. And she also did other translations from French, from Italian. So she was multilingual. She was a very well-educated and talented person. And just going back to where I began with her marriage, the advantage of marrying this much older man turned out to be that he was very supportive. Once she'd had 2 sons, he seemed to let her do as she liked. He did not interfere with her pursuing a literary career. There are different accounts of what happened in their home, but there are some accounts of of their home. It's a massive palace, being something of a literary salon, of people coming in and out, of there being a great library. It's hard to verify all of this, but she was a patroness as well. And there are many works dedicated to her. So she really created a kind of literary world around her.
Okay, so I'm really glad you said that, because I'm also wondering how she was received and perceived by the Elizabethan society, because this is not a common thing for a young wife of this noble, very wealthy man to do. I mean, she did have the 2 sons.
Yes.
You mentioned that. So she fulfilled that role. But then to go on and do these other things, that's pretty unusual. How was she perceived at the time?
Yes, it's a good question. It was very unusual. I would say she got away with it, and she got away with it on several different grounds. One, she was mostly doing translation, and translation was considered a more modest, more female appropriate form of writing, because you were taking the genius works of men and just making them accessible. So it was not original work in the way that, writing your own play would be. So that's one thing. Secondly, the family was famous enough, and specifically her brother, Sir Philip Sidney, was a kind of rock star of the era. And when he died, the country went into mourning. People have compared his funeral to Lady Di's funeral. I mean, just like a massive outpouring. He was probably the most famous courtier of the era, as well as a brilliant poet. And so her taking up his mantle was seen as the family sort of bringing his work out. So she protected herself with her brother's name and fame, with her husband's fame. when she did publish a French translation that she'd done of a philosophical treatise and of a play, she didn't use the name Mary Sidney. She didn't even use the name Mary Herbert, which was her married name. She used the name Countess of Pembroke. So she used her title. So obviously, being at the highest level of the English aristocracy really facilitated the way for her. And I would say, Carol, that is a common theme I've seen in women's writing. I also work on Italian women's writing. And, being an aristocrat, having a title makes things much easier, surprise, surprise, than being just an ordinary person. So, but, John Donne, as I mentioned, praised her tremendously. There's a number of other moments of praise, but there's also a couple examples of people in her aristocratic circles saying, there's no way a woman could have done this work. It's too good. So however much they might have admired her, the quality of the Psalm translation, for example, was such that even her husband's godson, who she knew well, said she must have had so-and-so helping her. Someone else must have done this. And when the manuscript circulated, they very often emphasized her brother's hand in it and not hers, even though he didn't even do, half of them in draft. I mean, she wrote 3 times as many poems as he did, but there are actually manuscripts that just say, David's Psalms by Sir Philip Sidney, and they don't even mention her. So her name got erased, and that helps us to understand what happened, for several hundred years, where they were mostly circulating as his work.
That's interesting. So although being the Countess of Pembroke does give her some leeway, and when we talked about Virginia Woolf and the room, some wealth, some ability to have your own space, that she had, but even so, she ends up getting erased, and society
That's right.
Yeah, it must have been somebody else. Couldn't possibly have been hers.
That's right. That's right.
Even with all those things going for her. So let's look at somebody who didn't necessarily have so much going for her. And that is Amelia Lanier, who is another woman of the time who didn't have all that going for her. So tell us about her.
She absolutely didn't. That's a great contrast. So, and that's, again, to your question of how did I choose these women, I was also choosing people who came from different circumstances, I would say. I couldn't always control that because most of the people who were able to write were born into, if not aristocratic families, very wealthy families at least. And that's because there was no schooling for girls. So in order for a girl to be educated, she had to be educated at home or in a home. But you couldn't count on going down the road to the local high school. You absolutely could not go to high school. You couldn't go to middle school. You could sometimes go to a penny school, which was just for the first few years. And even that was rare. So Amelia Lanier was born into really quite the opposite set of circumstances. Her father was an Italian immigrant. He came over with his brothers as musicians, and they were brought to England to play the recorder. They made a recorder group, what was called a consort, for Henry VIII. So Battista Bassano, as he was named, and his brothers all came from Venice. We believe they were probably from a Jewish family originally. So that's like a double, sort of foreignness. It seems they had converted, but the family was of Jewish origins in the north of Italy in Venice. So we have a kind of Jewish converted to Catholicism, Italian who came to London to play music. So it's not an aristocratic profile. Her mother was an English woman about whom we know very little, in part because it seems she was illiterate. We know that she was illiterate, or we surmise she was illiterate by the fact that she was not able to sign her own name on her last will and testament. She signed with an X. Now, it's very hard to calculate literacy in the period because there were plenty of people who didn't learn to write, but were able to read. So when we see that X, it doesn't necessarily mean she couldn't read at all, but it does mean she couldn't write her own name. Think about that. Think about the Italian father for whom English would have been a second language and who died when Amelia was very young, when she was 5 or 6. And then the mother who wasn't able to sign her own name. That woman, Amelia Lanier, went on to become the first woman in the 17th century to publish her own book of poems. And that book of poems is so sophisticated. It is so complex. These are not sort of songs that she was singing and she wrote down. These are poems in the Italian form of ottavo rima, very complicated rhyme form. Her main poem is over 1,800 lines long. So, she wrote this extraordinary book of poems that depends upon intimate knowledge of the Bible. It's a religious book of poems. It depends upon knowledge of lots of other literary works before her. So one of the biggest mysteries is, how did Amelia Lanier get her education, given everything I just told you? And if I were a novelist, I would come up with some great theories. But because I write nonfiction, I have to stick with the facts. And all I can tell you, so it remains a mystery. In the biggest sense, it remains unverified. But what we do know, and what is so interesting, is that when Amelia Lanier was in her late 20s, she was married. She was having trouble conceiving. She already had one child, but she was trying to have a child. She had a child out of wedlock, which we'll get back to. But she was trying to get pregnant with her husband. She went to see someone whom we would consider a quack. But at the time, he was considered a medical practitioner and an astrologer. So he would cast your horoscope and also look at your physical symptoms. She went to see him to see if he could predict if she was going to bear a child. And she was actually pregnant at the time and having some symptoms of discomfort and cramping, and who knows what was the poor woman, but she did end up having a miscarriage a few months later. So she was concerned about the pregnancy. She told this person that she was brought up by the Countess of Kent. How do I know that? I know that because this person, whose name is Simon Foreman, kept notes on all of his patients. Those notes have all survived and are in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So we can read backwards from what he wrote down. So it was a kind of intake appointment, the way we do when we go to the doctor and we give our medical history and we share things about our lives. It was something like that. And he wrote down a whole bunch of interesting things. One was that she was brought up by the Countess of Kent, which is amazing. How did that happen? How did she get into the household of the Countess of Kent? We don't know. But we know that her father was a court musician, that he had a direct relationship both to Henry VIII and to Queen Elizabeth. It seems he may even have taught Queen Elizabeth, when she was a princess, Italian, the language. And there are records of gifts being exchanged between them. And he gave her a musical instrument. He was clearly connected to her. So is it possible that he somehow introduced his daughter to this aristocrat who was in and out of court? We don't know. But it's not out of the question that aristocratic women took younger girls and educated them in their households. It's something that did happen during the period. And she would have been without a father, so that would have made her vulnerable. If her mother was illiterate, that made her especially vulnerable. So it's possible that family friends connected them. And in the book I go into, there's some interesting other connections between the Countess of Kent's mother and his, and so on. There's reasons to connect these people. So we know that Amelia Lanier claims that she was raised by the Countess of Kent. She also wrote a poem to the Countess of Kent in that first book of poems ever written by a woman in the 17th century. She wrote a dedication to her, and she thanks her for civilizing her, for teaching her manners, and so on. So they clearly had a relationship. The second thing I just wanted to say about the records left by this physician and astrologer is that she told him that she had had a child with an unbelievably powerful aristocrat in the court of in the court of Elizabeth, and that she had been the lover of Lord Hunsdon, who was Elizabeth's first cousin, and the Lord Chamberlain, like the head of the whole household. So Baron Hudson was the son of Anne Boleyn's sister, Mary Boleyn. So imagine that this girl who's an Italian, possibly Jewish, really not a fancy person, seems to have had an affair with Queen Elizabeth's first cousin, the son of Mary Boleyn, and bore his child. And she claimed that because of that scandal, this guy, her lover, set her up in marriage to one of the court musicians just to make sure she was married and taken care of, and treated her well. So it seems as if the marriage might have been made to save face for both him and for her.
Okay. So we have her story for that because she told the astrologer physician. So we have her story
Yes.
and the way she presents it. We have this powerful man that she says she's had his child, and they had this, wasn't it a fairly lengthy relationship?
She
Yeah.
claims that they were lovers for a year, that he kept her, she says, in great pomp, which sounds like he spoiled her with jewelry or with money or with clothing, and that it went on for quite a long time. I think what ended it was the pregnancy, because
Right.
then it became a problem.
Yes. Yes. And then she's been perhaps raised by the Duchess of Kent. So all of these are such unusual
Very
situations to
unusual.
bring her into court, but without a sense of belonging, because on her own, and I don't mean this as anything except an observation, because of her background, she doesn't belong at the heart
That's
of
right.
Elizabeth's court. So
Absolutely not.
so do we have any sense of how she navigates that? Because it's just a fascinating thing to think about.
It is really interesting. So it sounds as if she's quite sad about it, sad about being not exactly exiled, but losing her access to that world when the relationship with her lover came to an end. And in this book of poems that she published, so all of the events we're describing would have been in the mid to late 1590s. So when she sees Simon Forman, it's 1597. She already has her son. She's already married to the court musician, um, and so on. So, and Lord Hudson has died several years earlier, so she's on her own. When she publishes the book of poetry, that's in 1611. So that's a good, 15 or so years later. And before she gets into her poems themselves, she writes a series of dedications. I've already referred to one of them that she writes to the Countess of Kent, but she also writes to many of the aristocratic women of the period. It's like a pantheon of aristocratic women. And it seems as if she's trying to get one of them to kind of bite the bait, to take the bait. She's trying to get someone to support her and sponsor her, perhaps, because she seems to be down on her luck at that point. And in one of the poems, she refers to the fact that she'd been on the inner circle in Queen Elizabeth's court, but now under Queen Anne, who is James's wife, she's no longer there. She's lost her connection. And it's quite sad. And one of the dedicatory poems is actually to Mary Sidney, whom we were just talking about, the great poet and aristocrat. And she's clearly trying to get Mary Sidney to support her and to, maybe circulate her poems or to promote her name in some way. So this is a woman who was always struggling, I would say. It was not an easy life for her. And I say that because after this book of poems, which really is amazing and worth reading to any of your readers who are interested, because the heart of these poems is a very strong, we could even say feminist polemic about the fall of Adam and Eve, defending Eve against Adam, and about the crucifixion of Christ, which she blames on men and says, if only they had listened to Pontius Pilate's wife, who says, do not kill that just man. If only they had listened to her, the whole thing wouldn't have happened. But because they didn't, Amelia Laner claims men and women should be absolutely equal, that what they did to Christ was so much worse than what Eve did, eating that apple when she didn't know what she was doing. I mean, this is her logic. And so she makes this strong proto-feminist, let's say, diatribe about men, about women's place in society, why should our sex be inferior to theirs? And so this was a radical, radical piece of work. And it seems it didn't go over very well. All we know is this book of poetry was never reprinted until the 20th century. And Amelia Lanier was trying to make ends meet by opening a kind of schoolhouse. She was trying to get a hold of her husband's business patents. She was suing people. So within, 1611, the book of poems is published. By 1620, we have legal documents of her, pleading poverty, trying to get money from different causes. So this was not an easy life. To get back to the Virginia Woolf, she did not have money. She did not necessarily have a room, but she did manage to produce this extraordinary book of poems.
So, and that is fascinating. And again, this big contrast from Mary Sidney. But
Very much so.
How was she able to get something published? What was the publication process like? Because it's
a very interesting question. She did not have a patron. When she published the book of poems in 1611, on the title page, it refers to her as Mistress Amelia Lanier, the wife of the Captain Alfonso Lanier. And it seems that her husband, in this case, it was his connections to court that helped her. So, like her father, her husband was a court musician. So that meant he was on the salary of first of Queen Elizabeth, then of King James. He had a salary. When there was a royal funeral, he was given special cloth to make the appropriate clothes for the funeral. In other words, he was a staff member of the royal court. And it seems, and in addition to that, before I go forward, he had also volunteered to serve with the Earl of Essex on some military expeditions, so he's referred to as a captain. It seems that he had a few friends in high places. And it's striking that she uses his name on the title page because they did not seem to have a good marriage. I doubt very much that would have been her choice, but he must have been her avenue to publication. He must have somehow, opened the door, figured out a way to get this through. She also had one or two very powerful female friends, whom I talk a lot about in the book, because one of the other four women is a woman named Anne Clifford, who was younger than she, almost 20 years younger, and was one of the wealthiest women in the kingdom. Anne Clifford was at some point Amelia Lanier's pupil. It seems that Amelia Lanier was either tutoring her or was a companion, because Amelia Lanier knew very well Anne Clifford's mother, Margaret Clifford, who was also an aristocrat, and was invited to stay with those two women, or mother and daughter, in 1604 for a few months. She seems to have spent either a summer or a little bit longer than a summer into the fall as a companion, as a tutor. Maybe she was teaching Anne Clifford either music or French and Italian. In any case, there are dedicatory poems to both the mother and the daughter, Anne Clifford, who's the fourth woman in my book, and her mother. And she's clearly pushing for those women to promote her, to help her. And so it's absolutely possible that through their connections, that also helped to bring this book to publication. Again, it was published. It was registered at the Stationers Company, which is sort of like registering your copyright. It was printed. But after 1611, it was not reprinted until the 20th century, late 20th century. So it did not meet with great success.
Okay. So it was certainly an accomplishment, however she did it, to get it published. And we see that as a real highlight as a woman. But then it doesn't achieve this ongoing success because we lose it for all this time.
That's right. All right.
So these are just two and just parts of their story. So you can see why I wanted to stay on the airplane and keep listening, circle for a while. So as we sort of, so we've zoomed in, which is great. So as we zoom back a little bit and consider, again, these four women, and then you've indicated, in your course, there are 8 to 10. So there are a few more, there are hundreds, but there are these women who are making these strides in various ways, translation, poetry, plays, other ways that are, and memoirs as well. So creating this legacy that it has been difficult to find, but now we have it. What difference do you think that makes to the way we see the Renaissance, see Elizabethan and the court of James as well, the court of Elizabeth, the court of James, maybe particularly Elizabeth, but how does this enhance our understanding of the 16th and 17th centuries?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Until we discovered all these women, our greatest access to what women were like, how they might have been thinking, was frankly through Shakespeare's heroines, that people would think about Portia and Rosalind and, try to imagine Lady Macbeth as the negative example and so on. That this was what we would turn to. So if we take a step back and think, okay, women then as now were half of the population.
Yeah.
And we've literally only been listening to one half, right? We have not been hearing from them at all. What happens when we open things up and hear how women are experiencing plague and how women are experiencing, the Spanish Armada and the Civil War and, how, because in two of the cases, I have quite a number of either diaries or personal letters. And those are the two women we didn't talk about, Elizabeth Carey and Anne Clifford. Anne Clifford kept a diary more or less continuously from 1603 to 1676. So we hear firsthand what life was like in Elizabethan or Jacobean England, in her case, Jacobean and Carolinian England. We hear in Mary Sidney's letters too, and Elizabeth Carey's letters, how they're experiencing things. So what did it mean to be a mother? What did it mean to be married off to husbands without your consent? What did it mean to have children die? And very sadly, children were dying very frequently. Childbirth mortality was very high for mothers and for kids, but then, infant mortality or people dying in the first years of their life. So what did all of that feel like? We've always just heard male accounts of it, but all of a sudden we get to hear the female perspective. How did women understand the biblical stories they were hearing that they had to hear in church? How did women feel about the fact that they were being preached to, constantly about how they had to be obedient and silent and so on? So we know the message that was being passed on to them. But for example, in one of the other women that the two women we didn't talk about, Elizabeth Carey and Anne Clifford, Elizabeth Carey was a playwright, and she wrote this amazing tragedy, The Tragedy of Miriam, which is I think of it as a kind of talking back to Shakespeare's Othello. Let's actually not make Desdemona like a passive, accepting victim, but let's make a stronger heroine. But in that play, there's a character, Salome, who defends women's right to divorce. And, we never think about that, or we have no way of thinking about how did women feel when they were stuck with a terrible husband. We know how Henry VIII felt, and we know what he did to those women. We know even how John Milton, the great poet and writer, felt because he wrote several treatises about divorce. But to hear a woman talking about it, it changes the picture. So I think it literally like doubles the screen. Like all of a sudden we have a much bigger view of what daily life was like, of what family life was like, of what religious life was like, and so on. It really opens things up in a way that to me is really thrilling as a lifelong student and scholar of the period. It's just, I teach, Carol, I also teach a class on love poetry in the Renaissance, and I used to only teach men. And it was all the male poets, whom I love, by the way. This is nothing against them. I love them. I love John Donne. I love Thomas Wyatt and so on. But we're just hearing male ideas about love, male ideas about female beauty. Well, when you flip that around and get Lady Mary Roth, who was a great love poet, and you get Vittoria Colonna, who was a great love poet, things start to. So it's really a wonderful expansion, I would say, of our access to the entire period.
That is a wonderful way of thinking about it. And I love that example of seeing it through the poetry. That's just a really great example of how much we can benefit. Well, I just want to thank you. This has been wonderful. I
Oh,
really appreciate your talking me through. And I know we decided to go with two. I would love to talk to you about all of the other women, but thank you very much for the book first, but also for coming on and talking to us about these women who totally enhance, expand, and change the way that we see this period that we think we know so well, but now we can see it through different eyes.
well, thank you. It was wonderful talking to you. I hope I'll have another chance to talk to
Yes.
you and to your listeners again. But this was a wonderful conversation. I thank you for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was such a treat to have you. And come back again to Royals, Rebels, and Romantics as we see how history and all of these voices really do show us what's possible. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I really appreciate your support. If you could take a moment, leave us a rating, maybe share with a friend. Also, a huge thank you to all my patrons who literally make this all possible. Thank you so much, and join us again to hear about ways that history shows us what's possible. Thank you.